Hello, this is John Ritter, and you're listening to New York and Company with Leonard Lopate on listener-supported WNYC AM 820.
Critics called her memoir, Autobiography of a Face, unforgettable and exquisite. Now Lucy Grealy is back with a collection of essays she's called As Seen on TV, and in it she turns her keen eye and sharp wit to topics as varied as tango, Oprah, and the nature of narrative. The book is published by Bloomsbury, and I'm very pleased that it brings Lucy Grealy back to New York and Company today. Hello.
I'm very happy to be here again.
The story so far is an essay in part about the process of writing Autobiography of a Face. You didn't think when you started the memoir that it would have any kind of cathartic effect on you?
No, I thought writing the memoir would just be a sort of literary exercise for which I would get paid. And when I wrote the memoir, as I was writing the memoir, all my friends were very concerned that I should be in therapy and all this stuff. And I had all these my ideas of pop psychology in which one, let it all out and told one story, and that led to any kind of curative wholeness or any kind of healing
and closure.
I hate the words healing and closure, and I scoffed at the idea that writing my book would bring any of that to me. It did actually bring some of those things for me, not so much partly from writing the book, but also I think having the book do well and be successful, and it helped.
But if it's not going to have a healing effect, it still gives you a chance to think about things in a way that you rarely can think about them just on every day.
It taught me a lot about privilege, and the essay that you were quoting, the story so far, is really a story about my brother, and who had a very complicated life. And there were these moments when I was tempted to write the story of my brother, and the parts of me that were tempted to do it were mercenary, because I could probably get paid for it, and also this giving in to that, it will bring you to a new place of understanding. You will look inward by writing the story. But I also instinctively understood that it was much more complicated than that, and that, again, that essay is really about narrative process and what you can and can't get from writing a story, particularly your own story.
The one about your brother would have been retracing his steps, his life, because you barely knew him. So that would have been a nice narrative. It would have been like a mystery.
Yeah, I got this phone call from a private detective several years ago, and my oldest brother was a schizophrenic and left home when I was very young, and if he had walked in the room at any moment during my adulthood, I would not have recognized him. And then this private detective called me. One of his children had hired, a child I'd never met, had hired a private detective to find my brother, who actually at that point had been dead for a year from a car accident. And I agreed to talk to the private detective on the condition that he would send me a copy of his report. And about a year later, I'd totally forgotten about it. I got this thing in the mail, and I was like, what's this? And I opened it up, and it was the private detective's report, and it was all this stuff about my brother I never knew, and all about his life as an adult, of which I knew absolutely nothing. And then the very last page was a Xerox of his death certificate, upon which they had his name, and that was about it, and his birth date. And there are all these headings for father's name, blah, blah, all this stuff on a death certificate I didn't even know existed. It just kept saying none, 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 none. And it was a very intense emotional moment for me. And then when
To think that he died alone.
That I'm not going to say that I failed him in some way, because I was never given an opportunity to do anything for him. But until that moment, I always knew that I had a brother out there, and that he was mentally ill, and that he literally could be some guy I passed on the street. And that provided a sort of poetic way of understanding my brother, and I would relate to these other people on the street as if they were my own brother. And I felt that was far more fulfilling to me than trying to come to a narrative understanding of my brother and going and retracing his steps and following this private detective's report, which is what some editors wanted me to do.
Now, you were a poet before you started writing your memoir, and you've talked about the problems of having to write honestly in the memoir. Could you avoid that when you were a poet?
Well, one of the things that people complained about my memoir is that my family wasn't present in it, and they didn't understand that my family filled my poetry. So I would write about this fictitious family in my poetry, all these events that never happened, and yet the basic underlying emotional terrain about trying to find somebody who's going to tell you who you are and trying to find a home was much truer than if I had actually just told the facts.
But you didn't want to write about your family because you respected their privacy? This is always a problem when you write about yourself, isn't it?
Yeah. And also, in truth, my family wasn't a big part of the story that I told in the memoir, the story of having cancer, and also to respect their privacy.
But you say that loyalty to honest writing made you realize two things you'd never been able to accept before, that you had gone through an extraordinary set of circumstances, and that considering those circumstances, you'd actually done very well for yourself.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm sitting here on the radio, big time.
Was writing the book, to some degree, an attempt to become famous? Was that always a concern on some level?
No, it was, you have a fantasy that you're going to win the Pulitzer or something, but it was more, I think, an attempt to be loved. I wanted somebody to read the book and to love me. Mm-hmm. So, it was all about getting my foot in somebody's door.
And I've seen you at personal appearances, and there are always these gaggles of young women who follow you around, who obviously love you because they've fallen in love with you for reading your book. So, does that help?
It doesn't hurt.
Is that some kind of achievement?
It doesn't hurt. I always joke that my fan base is the same as like NSYNC's and Menudo's, which is like young girls and gay men, they love me.
You say that to write Autobiography of a Face, you had to re-inhabit your past, and that was a disassembling process. How so?
I think just going back and having re-inhabiting a moment so that you could look at it very objectively and openly, as opposed to having a preconceived idea of what a particular moment in your life means or meant, and going in there almost as an editor as you remember it, so that you're trying to use the scene as a point in an argument rather than an opening up of some kind.
Well, we never think of our lives as a form of narrative, but then when you write a book, you have to.
I think we all think of our lives as forms of narratives, either kind of incomplete ones, meaning that we think that there's some other narrative line our lives should be taking, and we have different feelings of shame and failure because our lives don't match up to this narrative that haunts us. And then I think the only reason things make sense is because they're in a narrative line.
So were you surprised by the narrative that you found yourself writing?
No.
Mm-hmm. After the book was published, were people calling you all the time with writing assignments?
I wouldn't say all the time, but certainly a lot more than I had before, which was never.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And then you became a well-paid prose writer. Did that change you?
It changed me for a little while. Of course, now I'm looking for new assignments if any editors would like to call me out there. But it changed the way that I looked at specific interests in my life and specific, any little anecdote, some weekend conversation I'd had with somebody or someplace I went, were no longer just experiences I had, but kind of fell into this, process of, gee, maybe I can write about this. Mm-hmm. It wasn't pleasant, really.
Well, I've been on the other side of it, where I've had a particularly casual conversation and looked up and seen a writer in the family's face suddenly transformed and thought, uh-oh, this is going to appear in something sometime. My guest is Lucy Grealy. Her latest book is a collection of essays called As Seen on TV, subtitled Provocations It is published by Bloomsbury, and we will continue our conversation after we take a little break here for the latest news on AM 820 WNYC, live online at WNYC.org. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Terry Jones, and you're not listening to Monty Python. You're listening to New York and Company with Leonard Lopate on WNYC, AM 820, New York Public Radio.
We're back with Lucy Grealy, the award-winning poet and author of the highly acclaimed memoir Autobiography of a Face. Her latest book is a collection of essays called As Seen on TV, and I suspect that you're not writing much poetry anymore. Have you switched over to writing prose all the time?
I have been writing one poem for about, I think I started it during the Gulf War. I'm still writing it.
Is it long or is it just difficult?
No, I've only got 2 stanzas. That, I was walking down the street the other day remembering myself as a very earnest young adult or old child, one or the other, in my college and graduate school years, and swearing to myself that I would remain true to my art, and I'll never, the day I stop writing poetry is the day I stick my head in the oven, kind of stuff. And I was realizing, it's all writing, and there are things about poetry which only poetry can do. But the truth was, I was a good enough poet, but I wasn't a great poet. And
is that your decision, or somebody else has told you that?
Well, I was always a finalist and never a final. And it just got frustrating. And then when the whole, the fact that I could actually make a living writing prose, at first I thought that it was just a diversion away from writing poetry, but I've actually really come to I love writing nonfiction. I love writing essays. And I also steal a lot of techniques from poetry in the writing of prose, and I feel very fortunate to sort of have had previous experience with that form.
You mean techniques like coming up with a really good metaphor?
No, techniques that have more to do with the kinds of risks you're willing to take, and also the shape of an essay, the way you can circle it back around in on itself. And I think a lot of people, and I just do that sort of naturally, because that's how so many poems work. It's through repetition and through not just the images themselves, but the order of the images and the way that they're presented and at what moment. And I think a lot of people who start essay writing or prose writing, they just come into it with this beginning, middle, and end idea. And a lot of my essays do.
Which is what we learned in high school. We say, so we set up with the preposition, the proposition, and then we tell what we want to tell, and then we end up by saying, and that's why.
Exactly.
Isn't that what we did in high school?
Yeah, and I have a whole essay. The title essay is basically about that. These neat, ordered essays that we're all taught to write, and really, it's not that there aren't interesting things said in a neat and ordered way, but a lot of really interesting things are said in very sloppy, runaround ways, and it's kind of a shame and a loss that we aren't taught how to recognize that.
Some of these essays are pieces you wrote originally for magazines, but you say that most of your magazine articles get killed. Why?
Well, I started writing this piece for some fashion magazine about, it was the year that everybody was wearing riding breeches around town, and I've been riding horses my whole life, so I would look at these riding breeches and understand that it was only the form which was, or the appearance of form in riding these on-the-street fashionable riding breeches that had any relationship to actual riding breeches, and that they were, if you were to try to use them for what they were meant to be used for, they would fall apart, that the function, of the item had been lost, and all that was left was this kind of, I called it a kind of ignorant idea of the form, because the the shape of riding breeches has to do with their function. They're related.
Same thing with cowboy boots.
Oh yeah, everything. But I started writing this innocent piece, and I got into this. Suddenly, the more I wrote about it, the more I realized how political it was, and how fashion relies upon a kind of stupidity and ignorance in the people who were buying it, and it turned out to be not suitable for a fashion magazine.
Because you were saying, you idiots, to all of the people who'd be reading the article.
I was also including myself in that. I'm an idiot. I wear fashionable things every once in a while.
Why wouldn't the readers of Vogue, who are obviously intelligent, I don't know if this was a Vogue or Mademoiselle or whatever.
I don't even remember.
But why wouldn't they find that interesting? Because in the end, that is something I'm sure that many of them think about.
I never got to have that discussion with the editors. They just sort of, first of all, they like their pieces short, and it's hard to say something. It's hard for me to write short. I have a lot of trouble writing something under 1,200 words, and most of them want like 700 or 900 words. So that's one reason it doesn't work too well. But I don't know. They just want. I'm not saying they always want this, but for this particular piece, it really got a little too, I think, radical.
But you call these pieces provocations and not essays.
Well, my publisher calls them provocations and not essays,
So this is an advertising tool.
It's an advertising tool.
You've said that when you're writing, you don't believe people will actually read you.
Yeah, I live in this complete bubble. It floors me anytime anybody's read anything I've written.
And when you finally see yourself in print, you say you even managed to shock yourself?
No, I don't think I shocked myself. I embarrassed myself sometimes because they're always taking, I was recently interviewed for Paper Magazine, and I had this wonderful over 2 hour talk with the woman who is a great interviewer about, the profundities of life and experience and la la la. And then I read this, 600-word piece that takes the 3 dumbest things I said and puts it in print. So, and one of them was, in one of the essays, I have this passing comment about men's anuses, and there it is.
And all those other profound things are on the cutting room floor. Well, tell me about the spirit of the staircase, esprit d'escalier in French. That's tied in with this. Although in the case of that interview, you said all the things you wanted to say, they just chose the wrong things. But you said that there are things that you wish you had said. We all have had this experience.
Is the French term for that feeling, when you think of the perfect thing to say after the appropriate moment has already passed. And we all have that all the time. That I started having that with major national TV talk shows. And
on Oprah?
On Oprah. I had a esprit d'escalier with Oprah.
What didn't you say, or what did you wish you had said?
Well, it kept changing all the time. One of the things was just how the show was set up with these 4 women. And we had all gone through some horrendous form of suffering and come out better people for it. And we had to say what we had to say in, a matter of, I think if we got 90 seconds, we were lucky. And then this guy who's an expert, is sitting there in the middle, and he's an expert because he wrote a self-help book. And I just, at the time I was like, something's not right here. This isn't right. And they want... But
you were the monkey. You were the performing monkey for him to analyze.
Well, he didn't say anything interesting, that's for sure. I wanted to title that essay for a long time, What I Should Have Said to Oprah. But then I totally chickened out because I thought, oh my God, I'll never be on the Oprah Book Club now. So I'm a total chicken, yellow-backed, whatever. Well, I'm assuming Oprah's not listening right now, although you never know.
You say as a child you thought being seen by many people, being seen on TV, for example, would make you more real than other people. So did you feel more real after you were on Oprah?
No, it's not that I felt less real, but the original, when I was a kid, I imagined being seen by that many people as somehow correlating to like dots on a newsprint photograph. And the more people who saw you, the sharper you would come into focus, that you would somehow be realer. And it's not that I phrased it in that way as a child, but it was this desire to be seen in some way that probably equaled being loved or known or something.
Well,
and then when I actually got on TV, apart from the fact that, it's not like I had a hit TV series on the WB or something, but people would recognize me, and I was less real to them. I was just as real to myself, but I could see that they had all these, they took me as a vessel for all their ideas about who they were and what it meant to be on TV, and just poured it all right into me.
You even wound up with a stalker.
Yeah, I did. Who might be listening at this moment. I'm not going to get
That's terrible.
Well, I think in the end, there are actually two stalkers. I think I'm okay. Let's put it that way. I think things are okay where that stands.
Lucy Grealy is my guest, and she's okay. Her latest book is As Seen on TV, Provocations, published by Bloomsbury. In your essay, What It Takes, you talk about learning to tango. What first turned you on to tango?
Well, that's actually one of my favorite essays in the book, primarily because it takes on so many different storylines. It's about my learning to tango, the history of tango, which I didn't know when I started out, was also the history of French imperialism in the 1900s, of all things. And also,
although nobody is sure what the real history is. Aren't there 33 different official histories?
Yeah, and even that, like some people say there are 54 official histories. It depends who you talk to. Tango, it turns out, is an incredibly complicated piece of culture. The dance itself is very beautiful and very complicated and very sexual. And one of the reasons I initially wanted to learn tango was this sort of allure, it had this allure to it that I wanted to participate in. And so I decided, well, I'm going to write about my taking tango lessons and just see where that goes. And so then I started reading about the tango, and I learned a few things. And as I was writing, I had to sort of think back and ask myself, well, when was the first time you ever saw the tango? And I realized it was watching the Addams Family, when Gomez would grab Morticia and go, tango! Mm-hmm. And I didn't know what tango was. I wouldn't understand tango as a dance and as this complicated cultural artifact for, another 20 years. And so what I wanted when I was watching the Gomez's or the Addams's tango was that sort of passionate bond that they seemed to have. And what I didn't understand when I was watching the Gomez's tango or the Addams's tango was that it was very much related to the fact that they were incredibly wealthy and upper class. And then I started exploring it, and I realized that, by contrast, somebody like the Munsters were totally working class. This working class family, he worked in a cemetery. Lily was his housewife who was always, doing all these house chores, even though they were backwards. She would spray dust on the furniture and boil frogs and stuff for dinner. But they never tangoed. They were working class, and they were physical freaks who couldn't recognize that they were physical freaks, and they never tangoed. Meanwhile, the Addamses were not physical freaks, but they surrounded themselves by freaks, and they had limitless wealth. And what I didn't know, it started to all click into place, because as I read about the tango started off in the mid to late 1800s as this low dance that it was danced in brothels. It was danced man between man and blacks and whites. In fact, it's the first time in recorded history, written history, that blacks danced openly with whites. That had never been written about before.
And that was a race class.
It was a big race class thing, and that's why the tango was so, taboo. Most upper class South Americans wouldn't even admit it existed. And then at the turn of the century, the French came along, and they had these shows of traveling exotics, which were basically American Indians and gauchos and stuff from the provinces. And they would tour Europe, and tango became this big fad. It swept across Europe. Everybody and their brother was tangoing all over the place. And nobody in Europe, understood the incredibly complex social significance of the dance. They just saw it as this fad, and it became dangerous to the Europeans only in terms of it was so blatantly sexual that they saw it as like, women would swoon when they saw tangos at the turn of the century.
But it's also a sad dance. You wear a sad face. You never make eye contact with your partner. Tango lyrics are usually about suffering from love, poverty, or oppression.
Carlos Gardel, he was one of the big tango singers. He defined tango as like dancing a sad thought. And I love sad things. And the tango, contrary to how many people perceive it, is a profoundly sad dance.
Why do you think Argentinians embraced it like no other country?
Well, in theory, it started in the area that was to become, known as Argentina to us. And one theory that is rolling around is that it became this European thing, and it became almost a commodity in a way. And then when Perón was in power, and he was trying to make Argentina regain all its national pride, but he was trying to do it so that Argentina would become more European. He sort of like took the tango back, and now it had this, European bourgeois stamp of approval on it. And so the Argentinians took back this thing that had been kind of drained of its complicated social and racial and economic taboos, and now had simply a sexual taboo to it.
So how did your personal lessons go? Was it sexy? Was it sad? Did you
get
the passion you were hoping for?
Well, I wrote about how I kept trying to get my dance instructor to be interested in me, so I would drop all these interesting asides to him about my fascinating life, but he never did fall for it.
And why do you think that is? He'd been with too many fascinating partners over the years?
There are too many of us.
A lot of these essays read like short stories. Have you ever considered writing fiction?
I am working on a novel, which, if my editor is listening, yes, I do know that it's overdue. I'm not avoiding you. I'm writing a novel. I'm writing my first novel, and I'm teaching myself how to write a novel as I'm writing it. And I've made a lot of mistakes along the way. It's much more complicated than I ever thought. So I've tried writing short stories that it doesn't really seem to be my genre, and I'm hoping the novel will work out. It will be just fine.
Well, you learned how to write essays
as I wrote them.
As you wrote them, borrowing from your experiences with poetry. So are you borrowing from both now, writing the novel?
I think so. And the mistakes that I make are usually when I think in terms of what I should be doing when I'm writing this novel. I should have this, and I should have that, and this should be happening. And that's where it seems to get really messed up. So I've had to sort of return to just writing it more by instinct.
Well, I'm sure you'll be invited onto the show when the book finally comes out.
I'm counting on it.
Lucy Grealy has published how many volumes of poetry?
Just one.
Okay.
Available on the internet.
Amazon.com. Also, Autobiography of a Face. And now a collection of essays or provocations called As Seen on TV. It's from Bloomsbury. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It was a great pleasure.